You know what's strange? We talk endlessly about boomers and millennials. We dissect Gen Z like they're some fascinating new species. But there's this entire generation that somehow gets skipped over in the conversation, barely mentioned, almost invisible. Generation X. People born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're your older coworker who never complains. Your aunt who somehow knows how to fix everything but never talks about her feelings. Your parent who gave you freedom, distance, and a weird kind of quiet loyalty that's hard to explain. And here's what nobody tells you. The psychology of Gen X might be one of the most misunderstood of any living generation. Because Gen X was raised in a very specific emotional climate. They grew up in the gap between old school authority and modern emotional awareness. Between analog childhood and digital adulthood. Between being told to toughen up and being left alone long enough to actually do it. And that combination created a generation that looks detached on the surface, but underneath is incredibly adaptive, observant, and psychologically self-protective. If you've ever wondered why Gen X seems so independent, skeptical, emotionally private, and weirdly competent in a crisis, this is why. Let's start with the part that shaped everything. Gen X grew up with distance. Not always cruelty, not always neglect in the dramatic sense, but distance. This was the generation of latchkey kids on a massive scale. Millions of children came home to empty houses, made their own snacks, watched younger siblings, and figured out how to fill the silence until the adults got back. Nobody texted to check in. Nobody tracked their location. Nobody asked how that made them feel. And when a child learns very early that comfort is inconsistent, the brain adapts. It stops expecting constant support and starts building self-reliance instead. That's why Gen X often seems like they don't need anybody. It's not that they were born emotionally distant. It's that dependence didn't feel reliably safe, so competence became their version of security. If I can handle it myself, I don't have to wait for rescue. That became the operating system. And here's where people get Gen X wrong. They're often described as cynical, but that's not exactly it. Gen X is not cynical in the lazy, performative way people often mean. They're realistic because they watched institutions break trust in real time. They grew up during rising divorce rates, corporate layoffs, political scandals, economic instability, and a culture that kept promising stability while quietly withdrawing it. They learned early that titles don't guarantee wisdom, that companies don't guarantee loyalty, and that adults do not automatically know what they're doing. So yes, they question everything. But that skepticism isn't a personality quirk, it's pattern recognition. When the world repeatedly shows you that systems fail and authority can be incompetent, your brain learns not to relax just because someone says, "Trust me." This is also why Gen X respects competence more than status. If you know what you're doing, if you've earned your place, they'll respect you deeply. But if you're all image and no substance, they'll clock it immediately. They don't care much about performance. They care whether you can actually deliver. And that says a lot about how they were shaped. Gen X grew up in a world where emotional expression wasn't exactly rewarded. You were expected to deal with things, move on, stop being dramatic, and keep going. So many Gen Xers learned to translate vulnerability into humor, sarcasm, or detachment. Not because they don't feel deeply, but because irony became safer than exposure. A joke could protect you. A shrug could hide you. Looking unbothered became a form of armor. And once that armor works for you long enough, it becomes part of your identity. That's why Gen X often gives off this cool, dry, no-nonsense energy. But beneath that surface, there's usually a highly tuned emotional radar. People who had to read the room early become adults who notice everything. Tone shifts, hidden tension, fake enthusiasm, unspoken power dynamics. Gen X can often sense what's off before anyone says a word. They may not always talk about it, but they see it. Another reason Gen X psychology is so distinct is that they lived through one of the biggest cultural transitions in modern history. They had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. They remember boredom. They remember being unreachable. They remember physical privacy. Embarrassing moments weren't permanent records, they faded, and that changes how you relate to identity. Gen X developed a sense of self before social media turned identity into a performance. They were not raised to narrate their lives in real time. So for many of them, oversharing feels unnatural, not because they don't understand technology, but because they were shaped in a world where privacy still meant safety. To Gen X, not everything is content, not everything needs to be announced, not every feeling belongs in public. And honestly, there's a psychological strength in that. They know how to hold parts of themselves back. They know how to exist without an audience. That's becoming increasingly rare. Let's talk about work, because this is another place where Gen X gets misunderstood. People often think they're emotionally detached from work because they're unenthusiastic or checked out. But that's not the full story. Gen X learned not to worship work. They watched previous generations give everything to companies that replaced them anyway. So they stopped believing in the fantasy of corporate loyalty. But here's the twist. They are often intensely loyal to competence, consistency, and usefulness. They may not make work their identity in a flashy way, but they take pride in being capable. They want to know they can survive anywhere, fix what breaks, and stay valuable even when the system shifts. Their confidence doesn't come from slogans. It comes from knowing they can adapt. And that may be the deepest Gen X trait of all, adaptation. Gen X is the generation of quiet flexibility. They don't always talk about what they've carried, but they learn to pivot fast. They know how to make do, how to improvise, how to keep going without ideal conditions. That's why they often seem weirdly calm during chaos. They've been preparing for instability their whole lives. While other people panic, Gen X often gets sharper, not because crisis feels good, but because uncertainty is familiar territory. But there is a cost to all of this. The same self-reliance that makes Gen X resilient can also make them lonely. The same emotional control that makes them steady can make it hard for them to ask for help. The same skepticism that protects them can also keep them from fully relaxing into trust. This is the hidden side of Gen X psychology. They are strong, yes, but many learn strength by suppressing need. They became the dependable one because being needy didn't feel available. They became low maintenance because nobody had the language or time to teach them otherwise. And when a child becomes emotionally self-sufficient too early, that doesn't just disappear in adulthood, it turns into habits. I'll handle it myself. I don't want to be a burden. It's fine. I'm used to it. And maybe that's why Gen X is so often missed in the cultural conversation. They don't make much noise about what they've endured. They don't brand their pain. They don't always ask to be understood. They just keep functioning. But functioning and feeling safe are not the same thing. And this is the part Gen X deserves more credit for. They became the bridge generation. They held the line between old and new. They raised kids with more emotional freedom than they had. They adapted to technology without growing up inside it. They remained skeptical without becoming completely hopeless. They learned how to survive change without letting change erase them. That's not emotional emptiness. That's psychological endurance. So if you're Gen X and you've always felt hard to explain, this might be why. You were shaped by distance, inconsistency, freedom, pressure, and transition all at once. You learned to rely on yourself because the world taught you to. You learned to question things because blind trust kept getting punished. You learned to value privacy because not everything needed to be turned into a performance. And you learned to be quietly strong because loud vulnerability didn't always feel safe. That doesn't make you cold, it makes you adapted. It makes you someone who built inner scaffolding early. Someone who knows how to keep going without applause. Someone who doesn't need to be seen every second to be real. Gen X was never the generation that asked for attention, but maybe that's exactly why their psychology matters so much. They're the ones who learned how to stand in the middle of change and hold their shape. The ones who grew up with less softness and somehow still managed to become solid. The ones who don't always say much, but when life falls apart, they're usually the person you want in the room. And maybe the most Gen X thing of all is this. They were overlooked, underestimated, and rarely centered, and they kept going anyway, quietly, competently, without needing the world to clap first. If this resonated with you, there's a good chance you've spent your whole life being stronger than people realize. If this hit home for you, subscribe and stay with me, because this channel is for people who've always felt a little hard to explain. And if you're Gen X, or you were raised by someone from Gen X, drop a comment and tell me which part felt the most true. I'd really like to hear your experience. And if there's another generation or personality type you want me to break down next, let me know below.